Lepa Radic was a hero who fought for her country against the Nazis. Her popularity came years after her death at the end of the Great War. At her age, many girls would be in the final lap of high school. But Lepa Radic was at the front of the war theater in Europe, defending her homeland from Nazi occupation. Known for bravery and courage, she is an echo of a young woman's impact on the partisan affairs of her country. Her life is an inspiration to young people for her bravery and commitment. Watch until the end of this video as we look at the brutal execution of Lepa Radic, the teenage girl executed by the Nazis. World War II, which began in 1939 and ended in 1945, was the deadliest and most destructive war in history. Before the war, Germany, America, and the rest of the world was going through the Great Depression. The economy was very bad, unemployment was at an all-time high, and massive inflation was causing money to lose its value. More than 50 nations of the world were fighting, with more than 100 million soldiers deployed. Countries like America and Britain were part of the Allied powers. Japan and Germany were part of the Axis powers. As the Second World War waged on, fighting was brutal at times along the Eastern Front. The Nazis had taken a huge amount of land across Europe, and many countries found themselves occupied by the Nazis. This meant that they were ruled over by them, subject to a police state, and oppressed. This oppression was coupled with horrific persecution of minorities, and over time, mass deportations of those considered undesirable began. Millions were sent to concentration camps before they were executed in the gas chambers. There were pockets of resistance across Europe who defied their occupiers and fought for their freedom. One such group was the partisans, who fought the occupiers across several different countries, and in particular, there was one 17-year-old girl who fought with them. Lepa Radic was an incredibly brave young lady. However, she was captured by the Nazis and executed at their hands, despite the fact that she was just a teenager. Lepa Radic was born on the 19th of December, 1925. Her family were Bosnian Serbs, and she was raised in a small village near Bosanska Gradiška, which today is a small town in the northwestern region of modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina. Her family were a hard-working group, and she had humble beginnings. Her relatives were communists. When the fascist Ustasha movement supported Hitler's invasion of Yugoslavia, families such as Lepa's were in great danger. Ustasha's ideology was built on Croatian nationalism and Roman Catholicism. The movement followed the racial purity beliefs of Nazism, and during the course of its time in power, it slaughtered hundreds of thousands of Jews, Roma, Serbs, and communists. Lepa's uncle, in particular, had significant ties to communism since he was active in the workers' movement, and Lepa Radic was greatly impacted by the people around her. She attended elementary school and went to the Women's School of Crafts in nearby Bisanska Krupa. As a student, she was known for her hard work and conscientious attitude with lessons, and she had a particular interest in reading. Lepa was reading at a higher level than her peers, and began at a young age to dive into political ideas that her family had been involved in and discussed. At the age of 15, Lepa Radic joined the League of Communist Youth of Yugoslavia, the SKOJ, and also the Communist Party of Yugoslavia. This was in 1941, and despite being a teenager, she was very politically aware. At this time, the Second World War had been raging for a couple of years, and a significant amount of territory had been ceded to the Nazis. It was starting to look like Hitler's eyes would wander east towards the Balkan states as he wished to attack the Soviet Union and head towards Moscow. Hitler ordered the Wehrmachts in the military to embark upon Operation Barbarossa, and the Nazis invaded many of the Balkan states. Hitler's plan for Operation Barbarossa was the biggest military operation in history at the time. However, within Yugoslavia, the government forced him to change his plans. As the Nazis came into power in the 1930s, the Kingdom of Yugoslavia tried to stay neutral and shared intelligence with Britain. However, on the 25th of March, 1941, it signed a defensive agreement known as a tripartite pact. This initially was an agreement signed between Germany, Italy, and Japan. However, what this agreement did in essence was to ally Yugoslavia with the Axis powers and the Nazis. 2 days later, the Yugoslavian military staged a coup helped by the British to install 17-year-old King Peter II as the head of government, whom many believed would try to stay out of the war. This made Yugoslavia more nationalistic, but Hitler issued Führer Directive 25, with which he deemed the new government hostile, and he ordered the German army to invade. The directive included the following points. Number 1. The military revolt in Yugoslavia has changed the political position in the Balkans. Yugoslavia, even if it makes initial professions of loyalty, must be regarded as an enemy and beaten down as quickly as possible. Number 2. It is my intention to break into Yugoslavia in the general direction of Belgrade and to the south by a concentric operation from the Fiume Graz area on one side and the Sofia area on the other, and to deal an annihilating blow to the Yugoslav forces. Further, the extreme southern region of Yugoslavia will be cut off from the rest of the country and will be occupied as a base from which the German-Italian offensive against Greece can be continued. There were additional orders in the directive. Feel free to look it up or wait for another mind-blowing video about this topic that we might have. Stay tuned until the end because you will discover how Lepa Radic made a name for herself and became an inspiration to fight for what's right. Anyways, back to our story. Yugoslavia was eventually invaded. This began on the 6th of April 1941 and ended 11 days later with the country's surrender. The Nazis annexed much of the territory and made Croatia and Bosnia-Herzegovina into the independent state of Croatia, and this involved Lepa Radic's hometown. The occupiers were basically a tyrannical puppet group directed by Ante Pavelic, who carried out horrendous crimes of persecution and genocide across the Balkans. The Eustatia governed over this autonomous nation with violence and terror, and they were responsible for it. The Eustatia aimed to create an ethnically pure Croatia and saw Serbs living in their territory as the biggest issue. They said that 1/3 of all Serbs would be killed, 1/3 would be expelled, and 1/3 would be forced to convert to Catholicism. There were truly horrific acts of pure, cold-blooded murder, including one near Lepa Radic's hometown, where a young ethnic Serb was beheaded by Eustatia's soldiers using a saw. Their laws echoed the race laws of the Nazis that resulted in so much death and devastation during the Holocaust. According to Nazi propaganda, the invasion of Yugoslavia was a success. However, the Germans failed to take control of the mountainous regions as the locals knew the areas too well. This failure allowed two resistance movements, the Partisans and the Chetniks, to emerge. The two groups, despite both opposing Nazi rule, were very different. Some Chetniks defied the Nazis. However, others were worried about the spread of communism within Yugoslavia. The Chetniks were more hesitant to carry out acts of resistance. The Chetniks were Serbian remnants of the Yugoslav army. They were not a cohesive bunch, and their only ideology was to create an ethnically pure Serbia that was devoid of Croats and Muslims. The Chetniks were also supportive of the Germans when it suited them. The Chetniks were Yugoslavian ex-military and loyal to the government of Peter II, now in exile. While some Chetniks opposed the Nazis, some factions collaborated with their occupiers. As for the partisans, Yugoslavia banned communism in 1921, forcing its Communist Party underground. After the Nazi invasion, the Yugoslav communists became the partisans. As their group held communist beliefs, the partisans were opposed by the royalist Chetniks. In response to the resistance, the Germans carried out horrific reprisals, massacring thousands of civilians. The Chetniks wished to wait for an Allied invasion to free them of the Nazis, but being cautious, this brought them into conflict with the partisans who wished for immediate action to rid themselves of Nazi occupation. The Radic family were rather dissident to the new government, and Lepa's father and her two uncles joined the partisans in July 1941. For this, they were arrested in November 1941 by the Ustashia. The entire family was arrested and jailed. Their future prospects looked very bleak. However, a few weeks after being jailed, the Radic family, including Lepa, were freed by the partisans. After regaining her freedom, Lepa, along with her sister Dara, began to become more involved in the partisan activities. They actively took part in the movement to fight the Axis powers, and Lepa took up arms, joining the 7th Partisan Company of the 2nd Krajewski Detachment. She first served as a nurse. However, she was seen as a useful tool for connecting with the youth in the partisan movement, and she began to recruit younger people into the group. She also took part in military operations, including one led by a group of young partisans to harvest grain close to where the German army was camped out. In January 1943, along with some Chetniks, the Nazis launched Case White, an operation against the partisans. Case White was the code name for a January 1943 offensive by the Nazis and their on-again, off-again allies, the Chetniks, to destroy the partisans. This operation devastated and almost destroyed the resistance movement. During the Battle of Neretva, Lepa Radic was responsible for transporting wounded soldiers to a shelter and hospital in Grimek. It was key that Lepa tried to rescue as many soldiers as possible, as partisan leader Tito decreed never to leave the wounded on the battlefield, as the Axis forces would simply execute them. So, Lepa's work was vital for the partisans. She worked hard evaluating and treating injured partisans. In February 1943, while the resistance was fighting against a 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division Prinz Eugen, Lepa was captured by a German detachment. She had been attempting to save 100 women and children from the area when she was captured. However, Lepa Radic refused to go down without a fight. Facing the SS division, she fought the enemy by shooting at the Nazi soldiers, unloading her rifle against the enemy. However, she simply did not have enough ammunition and was captured by the SS. After she was caught, she was imprisoned in an attempt to find out information that would help them to topple the partisans. Lepa Radic was kept in isolation and tortured. She stood firm, and despite the torture, the Nazis were unable to break her. Ultimately, the Nazis deemed her nothing but a partisan enemy, and she was sentenced to death. In Bazanska Krupa on the 8th of February 1943, Lepa Radic was led out from her prison cell by German soldiers to her place of execution. A gallows had been hastily constructed, consisting of what appears to be a piece of rope tied to a tree, with a box beneath it. Lepa Radic was led to the structure and a noose was placed around her neck. As this happened, she screamed out to the crowd, "Long live the Communist Party and partisans! Fight, people, for your freedom! Do not surrender to the evildoers! I will be killed, but there are those who will avenge me." The Nazi commander leading the execution then gave Lepa Radic one final offer to spare her life. For 3 days, the Nazis tortured Lepa in an attempt to get her to name partisans. She was offered the chance to save her life by giving up names of partisans. However, she stated, "I am not a traitor of my people. Those whom you were asking about will reveal themselves when they have succeeded in wiping out all you evildoers to the last man." For 3 days, she refused to give up her comrades. With this, the box was kicked out from under her, and Lepa Radic was executed by hanging in front of a small crowd who had gathered. She was only 17 years old. On the report written by the Nazis of Lepa Radic's execution, it read, quote, "The bandit girl hanging in Bazanska Krupa has shown unprecedented defiance," end quote. The execution was captured by the Nazis in a series of haunting photographs meant to intimidate and frighten the population. Instead, it had the opposite effect. She inspired them. Her bravery and courage inspired others to stand up for what was right. She showed that every individual can make a difference, no matter their size or gender. The legacy that Lepa Radic left behind continued on after her death. No matter how much she gave up, her death would be avenged, and it would be the turning point that brought about the eventual victory against the Nazis 2 years later. After World War II ended, the Yugoslavian communists under Tito became the country's ruling party. As a result, they recognized the Yugoslavian partisans as one of the most effective guerrilla armies in the entire war. Lepa's spirit encapsulated the partisan movement, and after the war, the Yugoslavian Communist Party led by Tito recognized Lepa for her bravery, awarding her the Order of the People's Hero. She is a girl who stoked the tyranny of one of history's most evil regimes. However, at the heart of this story was a young teenage girl who took up arms against Hitler's Third Reich. When she was brutally executed, she was only 17. And today, she is remembered as a figure of inspiration in the face of tyranny. Lepa Radic was not the only young lady who faced this kind of fate. Masha Bruskina was a member of the Belarusian resistance to German occupation. She was captured and hanged in public on October 26, 1941. And her body was left dangling from the rope for 3 days. She was 17 years old. Majda Gronvik was from Slovenia. After the Germans took over, she became a messenger for the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Slovenia. She worked to form communist groups, but her efforts were ultimately in vain. On May 4, 1945, the Gestapo had her arrested, subjected her to torture, and then executed her. She was just 23 years old. Zinaida Portnova joined the resistance to the Nazi occupation of Belarus and took part in attacks on Germans. In one mission, while working as a cook feeding Nazi soldiers in a garrison, she put poison in their food. Many became ill and a few died. In January 1944, she was captured, tortured, and shot. She was 17 years old. Another teenager killed by the Nazis was Zesława Kłóka. Zesława Kłóka was one of the 116,000 Poles deported from their tiny villages in the wake of the German invasion in 1939. The Nazis may have killed 14-year-old Zesława Kłóka at Auschwitz, but they couldn't extinguish the haunting power of the photo they took of her before she died. The deaths of these young people is a terrible tragedy that should have never taken place. The decade of the 1900s, however, was a difficult one. It is now time for us to make a difference. The legacy of Lepa Radic lives on. Following the war, Tito became president of a unified Yugoslavia, and Lepa Radic was honored with the Order of the People's Hero. Her execution was captured in a series of haunting photographs, and she was posthumously awarded the Order of the National Hero by the Yugoslavian government on December 20th, 1951. It is the nation's second highest military honor. She was the youngest person ever to receive the award. The valor and bravery displayed by this incredible young woman, who was only 17 years old, continues to serve as an inspiration to all who defy the forces of oppression and fascism. To this day, people all throughout Eastern Europe and the Balkans continue to remember and respect her bravery because of the role she played during the war. Lepa will be remembered as a national hero for her strength and courage. Decades after her death, many are still inspired by her courage. Apart from national honors, YCL celebrated her in commemoration of International Women's Day in 2019. As part of a month-long build-up to International Women's Day celebrations on the 8th of March 2019, the YCL published daily articles highlighting the exemplary role played by women in the international communist and working-class movement. They featured the life of Lepa Radic, truly an incredible young hero. Let's make sure that Lepa Radic's legacy is remembered and celebrated for generations to come. We should take her example as inspiration, empower ourselves to stand up for what we believe in, and strive for justice. Never forget the courage she demonstrated by standing up against the Nazis. Let us honor her memory by continuing to fight for a better world. Let us all strive to be like Lepa Radic and make a positive difference in our own lives. Let her bravery live on, inspiring generations of people to come. That's it for today. See you in the next video.